the Pacific Northwest's Puget Sound. Its waters form the nation's second-largest estuary and comprise the southern half of the Greater Salish Sea. With more than 4 million people calling it home, the Puget Sound region is known for its natural wonders, both above and below the surface.
The real beauty of Puget Sound is what lies under the surface.
More than 24 kelp species create an underwater haven for marine mammals, hundreds of fish species, and a diverse array of invertebrates and other organisms.
Puget Sound is a biodiversity hotspot. Kelp forests themselves are fueling, powering, supporting the marine ecosystem and the fisheries on which we depend.
Everything eats kelp. It's in the shrimp and the clams and the salmon and the whales. Kelp is the reason why estuaries are productive places.
They are these giant underwater forests that are just totally irreplaceable.
Kelp forests have played an essential role in this ecosystem for many thousands of years. As early peoples migrated into the Americas, a lifeway of kelp beds supported them with food and safe passage on their journey. Their descendants, known as the Coast Salish, comprise a loose grouping of indigenous nations who still live here. Kelp plays a significant role in their shared cultures.
Is also a very big indicator of the health of the sea and of our ancestral waters here.
In recent years, tribal citizens and Western scientists alike have observed that kelp is in serious decline in some areas.
We've seen significant losses. The first maps that we had were done in the 1870s, and there's kelp marked all over South Sound. It's gone. People are beginning to realize it matters. It makes a difference.
Kelp is very important to all marine species. It's also important to us as humans. We don't want to think about what happens if we lose it. If it disappears, it's more than just the kelp that will disappear.
Resource managers, scientists, tribal citizens, and advocates across Puget Sound are working together to solve the mysteries of conserving and restoring kelp forests. What does this region's interconnected history with kelp reveal about its current health? And how will kelp persist in the future?